Hi, my name is Chelsea Beeson. This is my presentation for course 699 at Morningside College. This presentation is over my research paper, The Effects of the Flipped Classroom on High School Business Students. I want to tell you a little bit about myself before we get started. I graduated in 2007 from Buena Vista University with a business degree. I worked in the business world for a few years and decided that maybe my passion was somewhere else, and so I went back to school and got my secondary education degree again from Buena Vista in 2011. I have been the high school business instructor at Carroll High School in Carroll, Iowa for the past 5 years. And now I am currently at Morningside getting my master's degree. So this presentation again is all about the flipped classroom and the effects that it has on high school business students. So again, I worked in the business world for a few years before I went back to school to get my education degree, and so I feel like I have maybe a little bit different view than other teachers might, as I've worked both with adults in the what we'd call the real world and students in the high school setting. So what I noticed when I started teaching at the high school level is that many schools did not have enough money to purchase the textbooks that they needed to stay up to date. So when I started, some of the textbooks that I was using were from the 80s, and they were not up to date for what things that the students should be learning. The other things that I noticed were that students are a lot more involved maybe in extracurricular activities, or there might be more pressure to be involved in things like sports and speech and other things that take place after school hours. And then lastly, that students need to have those part-time jobs that they work in after school. So, maybe they have some pressure from home to do that, or that is just part of their goal to make a little bit of money while they're still in high school. The last thing that I noticed was a problem when I started teaching, and maybe not even a problem, but just that technology has really changed the game and how students can learn. There's so much technology out there that if we use it correctly, it can really increase student achievement, and I wanted to understand how that component could play in a little bit more than it was in my classroom when I first started. So I chose the topic because what I was noticing was students kind of across the board were not completing their homework that I was giving out at night, and that was high level, low level, and also students in between. And part of that was they had those extracurricular activities and those after school jobs, but the other part was they weren't able to focus enough because when they had questions at home, I wasn't there to answer them. And then when they would come to me the next day with those questions, you could tell that their level of confidence in completing the assignment had dropped, and also maybe even their level of motivation had dropped. So I thought there must be some better way for all students to learn, those students that are high end, low end, and then those students in the middle as well. So I started doing some research on how I could set up my classroom just a little bit differently in order to help students learn. And I came across the flipped classroom, which I did a lot of research on. The flipped classroom has become a trend over the last 5 years in education. And what it is that it's just flipped from the traditional sense in what we would think of in a classroom. So the lecture that the teacher's doing, where the students are getting the content, that is done when the student is at home or outside of the classroom. So teachers are creating tutorials, videos that students can watch, and students are watching those at home. And then the work problems or the assignment is actually done in the classroom when the teacher is there to help the students with those questions that they're having. The traditional style of learning that maybe you and I were used to when we were in school wasn't working anymore because there were so many educational budget cuts that, again, those textbooks weren't able to be used, and students were using textbooks that were 20, 30 years old, and that content maybe just wasn't quite up to date. Also, the knowledge of the instructor that the school had hired wasn't being utilized at the right time. So the instructor was not there when the students had those questions. And again, I believe that led to some lack of motivation and just confidence in getting those assignments done. So in Woodland Park High School in Colorado, teachers began to meet to try and figure this problem out, and the flipped classroom was born there. This picture is a picture of Woodland Park High School, and these teachers started creating video tutorials that their students could watch from their homes, and then they started doing those in-class problems because that had freed up all of the time in class where they had been lecturing, and they could start doing those problems in class. So when I started this research project, I decided that I wanted to focus my research project on this one research question, which was, will implementing a flipped classroom model in the high school business classroom increase activity completion and student understanding? So again, I teach high school business, and so I wanted to see how that would increase student achievement, if it would, and just overall student understanding in my classroom. Those are the things that I thought could be increased with maybe a different setup in my classroom. The purpose of this study was to determine if this flipped classroom did have any impact on assignment completion, student achievement in my classroom. As I said before, that assignment completion, which was what kind of made me start thinking about this, I thought maybe we could see if that would impact their level of achievement and completion in my classroom. This research design was set up where students were tested on their knowledge of financial concepts and vocabulary prior to their semester beginning. This was where kind of those common financial things that we all need to talk about and need to know about when we're adults. So pretty basic level, but adult type financial concepts. Did they know anything about those prior to the semester beginning? Then throughout the semester, they were involved in the flipped classroom model in my high school business finance class, and they were retested then on those concepts and vocabulary at the end of the semester to see how far they had grown. Students were studied on their ability to complete assignments, both fully and on time, and they were studied on their ease of assignment completion, so how easy it was for them to find the assignments and complete those assignments. I studied 24 11th and 12th grade students who are taking a personal finance class at Carroll High School. In that 24 students, I had 13 females and 11 males. 94.4% of my students were Caucasian. The other percentage was Black and Hispanic students. I had 2 students with learning disabilities that were on individual education plans or IEPs, and I had 0 students that had a 504 plan or that had a major health concern. So that's a little bit of the makeup of my group that I studied to understand the effects of the flipped classroom. In my personal finance classroom, we used the Dave Ramsey Foundation's personal finance curriculum. And so how this works is we tested on what Dave Ramsey's curriculum says all high school students should know by the time they graduate from high school about financial concepts. And so we took that online financial pretest that I talked about prior to this slide, that tested their vocabulary and knowledge of financial concepts. Then throughout the semester, we watched online videos and tutorials, and some of those video tutorials were of me teaching, and others were of the Dave Ramsey curriculum, of him doing his online learning about those financial concepts. So those were watched when the students were at home, and so that was where they got their content. And then in class, we did the work problems, or the kind of the math of the finance class, where they would have those questions. At the end of the semester, they took that same pretest. We called it then their post-test, and we watched to see how they grew throughout the semester. We looked at assignment completion through our Infinite Campus grading system to see how many students had late work and how many students had incomplete assignments when the semester was finished. And we also had the students take a student achievement assessment that had them self-report on their ease of assignment completion and how successful they thought they were. When I looked at the results from this study, I found that the hypothesis was supported. Student achievement did rise and assignment completion did get better. However, that effect was not statistically significant. So students in the experimental group did see a higher growth from their pretest to the post-test than those that were in the control group who did not have a flipped classroom model implemented. And students in the flipped classroom model did have a lower percentage of incomplete assignments on average. So what I thought would happen was that student achievement would rise and that assignment completion would be better. They would have less late work and less incomplete assignments. And those things did happen, but not at a high level. It was not a significant change between that control group to the experimental group. You can see here from my pretest to my post-test, again, the hypothesis was supported. Students in the control group, those that were not involved in the flipped classroom, saw a 9.83% growth from their pretest to their post-test, and students that were in the experimental group, who were in the flipped classroom, saw just over 11% growth. You can see here in this table the number of students, my 24 students in each class, and those percentage growth here. As far as activity completion, my hypothesis was supported again. The students that were in that control group who did not receive the flipped classroom model had 0.67% of their assignments not complete. So those are incomplete assignments at the end of the semester. The students in the experimental group only had 0.5% of their assignments incomplete. So that number did drop, but as you can see, by not a whole lot. So again, here's that table that shows my 24 students in each group and that percentage of incomplete assignments. This study has many implications on people that may want to try out the flipped classroom, teachers that may want to try this in their own rooms, and for the students that would be involved and the parents that would be involved. So first, if teachers would want to try the flipped classroom in their own classroom, they need to be fully prepared to implement this model. There's a lot of groundwork that needs to be laid in order to have the flipped classroom work as far as video tutorials go. And then also students and parents both must be educated on the flipped classroom because it is different than what they have been used to in the past. And so the benefits need to outweigh the change that it'll be for parents and students. So that needs to be discussed, and parents and students both need to be educated. My study did have some limitations, including a small sample size. I studied one group of 24 students compared to another group of 24 students in a small rural town. So if that sample size was small. I also think that because I had the students self-report on how they felt their assignment completion was, that may also have been a limitation to this study. The lack of long-term study, this was only held over one semester of time. So, the effects maybe increase if they would have been introduced to it over a longer period of time. And lastly, there were some differences in those two groups that were studied, and so just the lack of similar groups was a limitation. My recommendations for further studies is to look at a larger sample size, maybe across a larger geographic region, to measure ease of activity completion without self-reporting, to measure that in a different way, to study the effects of the flipped classroom over a longer term, and to study more similar groups of students to eliminate those outside factors. These are the references that I used in this presentation. Thank you for listening and for taking the time to watch this presentation.